Hello, everyone. Dr. Tracy McCready here of Rhombus University. We are here on February the 6th, 2025, and our guest speaker tonight is Fred Blackburn. So take it away, Fred. Thank you for being here tonight.
All right. Thanks so much for having me back. And before we get going for tonight, I'm curious if anyone had any thoughts about last week's talk on the artistic temperament. And anything you wanted to share about that before we move on to tonight's topic? I really enjoyed the discussion we had afterwards, and I love some of your strategies and assessments of the situation and things you could do to help someone that was struggling, especially in those lows or down times after the creative energies had gone out of them. Okay, last chance.
Okay, I just want to ask one question. I know it sounds silly. You know that video you were talking about, Vision?
Oh, yes.
Okay, how do I find that?
If you just go to YouTube
Okay.
and search for Hildegard von Bingen,
Oh, my God.
and I can throw that in the chat for you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
And you'll find plenty of her music.
Okay, I appreciate it.
This is a side note, Fred, but look.
Pretty.
Oh.
That looks a lot like number one.
Yeah.
Okay, well, tonight's going to be a little unusual, as if any of my talks aren't unusual. But tonight, let's see. Tracy, am I a co-host? I'd like to share a PowerPoint.
Yes, you are. I made you a co-host.
I'm just not seeing my share button. There it is. All right, can you guys see that? Wisdom from the Woods? Give me a thumbs up. Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so this is very helpful to me in a few ways. For one, I've had all this stuff percolating inside me for quite some time. I am a lover of trees, a dendrophile, or a nemophile, which is a lover of groves. And I've loved trees as long as I can remember. But once I moved up here to Humboldt, California 3 years ago, I'm almost to the day. I've been up here 3 years, and it's just taken my love and knowledge of trees to a whole nother level. And I also, those of you that are familiar with Hume Lake Christian Camps and the Joshua program, it's a gap year program, which is for people who have finished high school. Some of them have even done a little bit of college, but they're not quite sure what they want to do with the rest of their lives. So it's a program where they get to study the Bible, learn some theology, learn some scripture, but it's also very service orientated. So they're up in this lodge on top of the mountains in the foothills of the Sierra and Kings Canyon National Park, or just inside Kings Canyon National Park. And they can accommodate 50 students, and it's co-ed. And they do a lot of trips to like inner cities, to Mexico, Dominican Republic. They had been going to Israel every year, but sadly, they've had to put that on pause for a couple years because of all that's been going on there. And so this is one of the talks I'm going to be doing for them as well. So you're going to be my trial run. Over the years, one of my students came up to me after graduating, and she said, "Professor Blackburn, I just want to thank you. I never really looked at a tree before until I took your class." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Obviously, I'd seen trees. I knew what trees were, but I never really looked at a tree." And so I'm hoping, if nothing else, after this talk tonight, I can get you guys to actually look and observe and see what you can learn from our tree friends. All right. And there's so much material here and I don't want to rush it. So I'm just going to do as much as we can. If I don't finish the presentation, I'm just going to pick up in March when I get to come back and see you again. So I hope that works for you all. So here we go. Wisdom from the woods. Why trees? Trees are ancient living witnesses of time. They embody patience, growth, and interconnectedness. Trees teach us lessons of resilience, adaptability, and peace. How to begin your journey with trees. Observe. Spend time in nature. Notice the unique characteristics of different trees. I don't know if you ever saw that Bill Gothard, it was like character sketches they did with animals. And each animal, they talked about its different strengths or virtues, or maybe its weaknesses or shortcomings. And then they applied verses. And it was a really nice book just using animals, in this case in nature, and then showing how they related to different people in the Bible or different strengths or weaknesses in our lives as humans. And someday I'm going to try to do a similar thing with trees. And because trees, like people, come in a variety of shapes and forms with gifts and liabilities. Listen, sit quietly and observe how the wind moves through their branches or the sounds of their surroundings. I don't know if you remember, especially in like the major prophets like Isaiah, when he talks and he describes the voice of God, and he describes it as the sound of rushing waters. And that's how the wind is through the boughs of the trees. It sounds like rushing water going on over your head. And then the trees in a strong gale will begin to sway and they'll creak and moan. And just like ships, wooden ships on a wooden dock, they rub up against each other, and it almost sounds like whale song in the forest where they're going. I could just listen to those trees creaking, groan for days. A lot of my friends and people that live up here won't go into the woods when it's windy, but I find it quite invigorating. Touch their bark, leaves, and roots. Feel the textures, the temperatures, observe the patterns. And I learned this from my year-old nephew. Taste. That's the first thing he did, was put his mouth on the trees. And I thought, oh, yeah, what a great way to explore and to know. Reflect. What does this tree remind you of in your own life? A lot of what I do in the woods, I would call forest forensics. And what I mean by that is, when I see something like a tree or a landslide or erosion, or it could be anything, I try to take in the scene just like an investigator and try to determine, why are things the way they are? What could have happened in this landscape to produce these types of trees or these types of phenomena? Set an intention. Approach the trees with respect as you would a teacher or elder, for indeed, many trees are quite your elders. Some are your elders by millennia or more, if you can imagine. Be open to the lessons they might share with you. And if the Holy Spirit dwells within you, realize that you have the actual creator inside your very being, and you are walking in his creation. And God is actually getting to observe his creation through your eyes. I mean, how cool and trippy is that? That's where my head is at when I'm in the woods. I'm walking with my Father through his creation and just telling him how amazing and wonderful he is and how much it's blessing me. And once again, like all my talks, if anyone wants to jump in or share an observation or ask a question, feel free.
Fred,
Yes.
I've heard some more, but I haven't really looked at the science information related to it. That if you literally hug a tree, you gain really great energy from it. But mind you, I haven't researched like the facts and science. But so like sometimes when I go walking, then in my route there's trees. So I'll hug the tree and I'll come back and I'll go back and hug trees. And then I'm thinking, oh my God, they probably think I'm weird. And then I'm thinking, well, who cares?
Good for you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, we'll talk about more of that, like the therapeutic uses of trees. And once again, qualifying, I am not a licensed therapist or any of that, but I'm just sharing some of my observations and things I've learned and gained from these experiences.
Fred,
Yes.
so along that line, I used to live in Julian. I also lived in Alpine before, and I could literally, even though I wasn't hugging a tree, but I could feel my whole face just start to relax as I was driving up the hill, because more and more trees are around, and you can just feel it. Like I felt my face relax as I drove away and got closer to them. Because especially in Julian, because they're like, oh, well, before the fire, it was really beautiful. You could feel it even though you weren't touching them.
Yes. Yeah, trees have quite a presence, and which extends, I believe, beyond their physical form. Just I think it's the same with us too. Like you can feel a person's vibrations before you may even see them or be physically next to them. Just one of the therapeutic benefits physiologically I'm going to talk about right off is just the tremendous amount of oxygen you get when you're in a forest, as the trees are scouring the air of carbon dioxide and they're releasing oxygen back into the air. We become recipients of that, and it's a huge benefit. And supposedly, the health benefits of just a several-hour walk in the woods can last you for months, improving your immune system and others. But that's getting more medical and technical, and so let's move on back to the metaphysical, where I'm at home. All right, can you guys see that the seeds? Okay. So the gift of faith is like a seed being planted within our hearts. And I just want to take a moment to define what I mean by faith here. Faith is one of those words that has a huge spectrum of meaning in our culture. And it did, I think, for the people in the Bible as well. But Friedrich Nietzsche was not a person of faith. In fact, he thought faith was nothing more than wishful thinking, things that we wanted to be true. And in a lot of ways, when you think about it, it's important to distinguish what I believe is a God-given faith. And the scripture tells us that faith is given by God. It's not something we can snatch out of the heavens on our own, or by unturning enough rocks or peeking behind enough trees that we can discover faith, but it is a gift of God. And so I'm using this metaphor of it's like a seed that's planted in the very core of our being. And like a seed, it starts small and gentle and fragile, but over time, given nurturing and care, it will grow into a great tree that will bear fruit and be a blessing to others. But this type of faith comes from God, and God gives it by measure. It's part of why we're not supposed to compare our faith with other people's, because God has given us each the amount of faith to do the task and purpose He has for us in this life. So it begins as a seed planted deep within us, small yet full of potential. With time nurturing the right conditions, it grows strong, taking root. As it matures, faith becomes a testament to resilience, patience, long suffering. And here we bear fruit, offering shade and sustenance to others. Like a seed, faith needs light, water, proper soil, and care to thrive, nourished by community, scripture, prayer, and spiritual practice. But always remember, its source of life and growth is the Holy Spirit Himself. Pre-growth stages. Just like trees, we go through cycles and stages of life. The seed, the beginning of life and faith, represents potential and new beginnings, a time for planting, nurturing, and trust in unseen growth. Secondly is the sapling stage, early growth and learning, a stage of vulnerability and rapid development, importance of strong foundations and values and beliefs. Mature trees, flourishing and bearing fruit, reflect spiritual maturity, productivity, and the impact on others. A period of providing shade, nourishment, and support to others. And lastly, even fallen or dead trees can leave a legacy or be there for renewal. Even in death, trees nourish the soil and foster new life, a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and the lasting impact of one's faith. I love this, using these metaphors of the tree. And if we start at the roots, the basics, right? That's our foundation, what we believe, what we hold to be true, what is reality. And out of that comes the trunk, our values, what we think is best. Actions, the branches, what we do, how we reach out beyond ourselves, and then finally the results, that fruit that is being produced in our lives. This is a little parable I wrote a few years ago, and I'm just going to go through it with you and we can talk about it. Parable of the Three Trees. There was once in a certain garden 3 fruit trees. All 3 trees were planted by the same gardener and given the same care. Each received the same amount of sunlight and water, and all 3 were planted in the best of soils. Yet all 3 trees grew differently from one another. The first tree grew quickly and flowered, bringing forth an abundance of fruit in its first year. Everyone who passed by was amazed at the rapid growth of the tree and all the good and beautiful fruits it produced. Tragically, however, when the season's first storms arrived, the tree was found uprooted, blown over in the wind. The tree that had appeared so strong and healthy was now revealed in its entirety. All its strength and energies had gone into its branches and fruit, but its roots were shallow and weak, leaving it vulnerable to the strong winds which sometimes passed through the garden. The once beautiful tree now lay on the ground, its abundance of fruit rotten, and its trunk and branches cut up to be burned. The second tree. It grew very differently from the first. It seemed to grow much slower than the first tree and produce very little fruit its first year. Yet its roots were deep and extensive, so much so that its roots spread out into other parts of the garden. It easily withstood the seasonal storms and even seemed to grow deeper and stronger in its position. The years passed and the tree continued to grow stronger, sending its roots further and deeper, yet the tree still produced little or no fruit at all. Rather, it began to send up new shoots and sprigs from its elaborate root system. So many new shoots and sprigs began to grow from this tree that they began to choke out the younger trees in the garden, depriving them of light and water. The gardener would faithfully prune these outgrowths every year, hoping that the tree would begin to grow fruit. Yet every year the branches remained barren, and the offshoots grew thicker and more abundantly than before. Finally, the gardener cut down the tree and dug out all its roots, for it was not only a worthless tree, but was harming the other trees in the garden. This tree, like the first, was in the end good for nothing, but to be burned. The third tree. On first appearance, it seemed very similar to the second tree, for it grew slowly and seemed to be sending its roots deep into the soil. Unlike the second tree, however, it also spread forth its branches, and flowers and fruit were found on it, even in its first year. Although its growth was slow, it was strong and consistent. It too was able to withstand the storms that swept through the garden. For yearly, its roots grew stronger and deeper, like the second tree. It would also send forth new shoots and outgrowths from its roots, and the gardener would prune them back, along with any branches that did not bear fruit. Unlike the second tree, however, it would abandon those parts that had been pruned and send forth new growth in its branches, including blossoms and fruit. Every year the tree would grow, and every year the gardener would prune it back. Yet with each pruning came new growth, and the tree flourishes so that in time its blossoms and fruit even exceeded that of the first tree. As the tree aged, it became more and more beautiful, and its fruit became more abundant and sweeter. Its roots were deep and strong, protecting it from the droughts of summer and the storms of winter. But most importantly, the tree entrusted itself into the hands of the gardener, who directed it in the way it should grow. Now, among the 3 trees that had been planted in the garden, only one remained. It had learned the importance of sound, deep roots to withstand the storms of life. More importantly, it had learned not to resist the gardener, but to allow its roots and branches to be molded and formed by his hands. And finally, the tree had learned the importance of bearing much fruit and was a blessing to all those who passed through the garden. And so the explanation of the 3 trees, and I'm going to read this slide and then maybe we'll talk about those other trees instead of me reading it to you. The garden is the church, and the gardener is God. The 3 trees represent 3 types of people and how they respond to the Word of God and God's guidance in their life. The Word of God is represented by the sunlight and water, all of which the trees had equal access to. The roots of the trees stood for sound doctrine and the knowledge of God, while the fruit represented good works and an outflowing of God's goodness to others. The basic theme of the parable is to show the dangers of producing fruit without sound doctrine and the equal danger of having sound doctrine yet bearing no fruit. The 3rd tree showed the proper balance between the 2, along with its desire to be yielded to the gardener. Any thoughts, comments on that one? Have you met these different types of trees at your church or in your own life? No, Blackburn, we have no idea what you're talking about. You're tripping us out with all this tree talk.
No, I definitely can connect to some of it. It's very similar in some ways to the parable of the sower, one of the parables Jesus told. But I do take contention with one part of it, and that's the idea that we are the ones responsible for producing our fruit.
Good for you, Rocky.
Yeah, John 15 reminds us that it is that our abiding in Jesus is what produces the fruit. That's not us.
Right.
And so I forgot the exact way you phrased it. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if you wrote this. Let me take that back. The way this was phrased was something along the lines of producing fruit without sound doctrine. And I find a challenge in that. That doesn't
sound
quite
doctrine would produce fruit.
no, that we can produce good fruit, period. The good fruit only is produced by God. We are just the conduit through which fruit comes out.
Very good, Rocky.
So that would just be my comment.
I love it. And I absolutely agree. That's the problem with metaphors, right? If we push them too far, they'll start to break. But I agree with you, Rocky. We are just conduits, and we get the great privilege of actually having that power of the Holy Spirit flow through us. And what's being produced isn't our fruit. It's the fruit of the Spirit. It's the Spirit's fruit. And how wonderful.
Absolutely. And we get to have the pleasure of being the ones that get to be the conduit of that.
Yes.
Even though it's not our creation. Like
Right.
what a blessing that is from God that we get to be a part of that.
Very good. All right, onward. Unless someone else wants to share.
Ironically, we never get to sample our own fruit
Hmm.
as a tree, since a tree cannot take a bite
That's
of its
not
own
for
apple.
us, is it?
No.
Very good. Whoops. What did I do? All right, give me a moment. I X'd out the wrong one. All right. See if I can share this again. All right, can you see the presentation again? Okay. And this is kind of like what Rocky was talking about. In John 15, Christ tells us that if we abide in him, we will bear fruit. Yet even those that bear fruit will be pruned. This is not for punishment or oppression from the gardener, but God prunes us so that we will bear even more fruit. This is where the third tree held the key to its growth, for it willingly gave up those parts that the gardener cut away and yielded itself into the guiding hands of the gardener. And in one of my other presentations, we actually went through this John 15 PowerPoint where we talked about the pruning and the grafting and all these different aspects of trees. And my prayer for us would be that we all be yielded to the gardener like the third tree, letting go of those parts that God has taken away from us. Maybe we send our roots too deep into his words that we may we send our roots deep into his word that we may be satisfied in times of drought and stand firm against the strong winds of spiritual oppression. May our branches also be broad and full, providing shade and comfort, but may they also be full of fruit that they may bless all who pass by. For the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and self-control. Herein is the Father glorified, that you bear much fruit. And Psalm 1, even from a child, was one of my favorite Psalms. David using the metaphor of trees and as those with the favor of God. Blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are as the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly will perish. And we often think about God pruning things from our life, and we can think about, oh yeah, that was a rotten branch, or it wasn't stable, or it wasn't bearing enough fruit. What's really hard to take is when God seems to be pruning branches that we become particularly fond of. It could be a branch of a relationship or a ministry or something we enjoy. But are we able to be yielded to the gardener and realize that we don't always know what is in the best interest of our own life and growth? Does anyone have any example of that where God pruned a branch from you and you just couldn't believe it because you thought it was such a great branch and it seemed to be bearing fruit and everything, and you're just like, oh gee whiz, God, what is going on?
I think that
I feel like
oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think that happened for a lot of us during COVID. But for me specifically, last year, or it's almost been like a year and a half, my daughter went to spend a year living with her dad to go to school, and I also injured my back. So when they both happened, I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to do some growing this season, and I'm tired and I don't like being pruned, but yeah. And I used to be a dance instructor and run around with kids and stuff. So it was a very humbling season that I'm still easing my way out of.
Very good. Thanks, Tawny. That's a great example. Anyone else
and
have any?
I
Yep.
yeah, I was just gonna say, like I've been in this school position where I've been having an opportunity to work with kids, but now it's like this job is coming to an end, but it's also at the same time that I'm getting ready to start practicum. So it's just kind of like, you know, at first I didn't see what God was doing, but then when I seen how it's coinciding, like the same time this is coming to an end, I'm getting ready to be finished with my last class to start that. So it's just kind of like, although this is the field that I'm going in, he's cutting that branch to get to the next level. So then I can, you know, well, whatever his plan is, but most likely get back into that field in a more professional way. So I feel that relates.
Excellent. Thank you, Cindy. All right, now let's go on to some parts of the tree. The importance of roots, grounding, and interconnections. What was so interesting, one of the things that was so interesting to me is when I moved up to Northern California, the first job I got was actually as a park interpreter. And they saw my years of teaching experience and thought I would be a great fit for them. Now, a park interpreter is kind of like a ranger, except you're not law enforcement. What you're doing is you're kind of like introducing people to the forest, and you're introducing the forest to the people. And part of the interpretation is learning about the trees, their role in the environment and the ecosystem, the plants and animals, ecology. I'm sure you're aware of. It's learning about the interconnections. And so it's not just learning the names or things about individual plants or animals, but it's seeing how they're all interconnected together. And what I realized early on is these people obviously knew so much more than me about the trees and the plants and animals and history. But what I realized was most of them were materialist. And if you remember that worldview, they only believed in the physical material world. They didn't believe in a soul or spirit. And so when it came to trees, they knew a lot about the biology and physiology, anatomy of trees, how they worked, how they grew, how they reproduced. But I realized what I wanted to know was the trees as individuals, as persons. Like the same with you all in this room. Let me stop this a sec. I mean, I can tell that you're probably all human beings based on your appearance. You look like different variations of the human species, and that's fascinating. I'm interested in that. But more so than your physiology or your gender or your ethnicity, I'm interested in who you are in here and in here. I want to know you as beings, as persons. And so when I'm going into the woods, I've loved learning about the physiology of the tree and the biology, and I'm going to share some of that tonight. But it's all just secondary to me because what I'm trying to encounter are these trees themselves as individuals. And that's what I'm doing in the woods. So with that little caveat, let me continue. So roots, grounding, and interconnections. The foundation of life, roots anchor a tree to the ground, providing stability even in storms. It is a source of sustenance. They draw water and nutrients from the earth, nourishing the tree. Through unseen roots, though unseen, roots often extend far beyond the visible canopy, demonstrating the unseen effort behind growth. We have oaks and pines in California that can go 80 to 100 feet deep. We have certain types of plants in the desert whose roots are 5-10 times the depth that the plant is tall, and because of its environment. Roots remind us of our need for grounding, connection to our origins, and a strong support system. And this picture here is of the bristlecone pines that live in the White Mountains of California. These are the oldest living trees in the world that we're aware of, at least single stem, non-clonal trees. And look at the roots on this. Bristlecones have actually very shallow roots, and so they have to spread them out as far as they can horizontally, since they don't go deep into the soil, what precious little soil there is. I mean, these trees are practically growing right out of rock in the White Mountains. And one of the leading cause of death to these trees, it's not disease or fire or any of that, it's erosion. As the soil of the mountains slowly slips away, it can leave the trees stranded and high and eventually lose support into the ground. Redwoods are the tallest trees in the world, but they don't have a taproot. In fact, where the taproot should be is often the weakest, most decomposed part of the tree. And some of the literature I've read on that, it says because of the massive weight of these trees forcing down, the way these trees keep from being toppled is they send these horizontal roots that can go 100 feet out from the trunk of the tree. If you can imagine the roots of these trees extending out 100 feet in every direction. And they interconnect and even inoculate, which here's an example in this slide. See how these roots are fused together? These roots not only fuse with themselves, but they spread out through the forest and they fuse with the other trees. And so not only are they entangled, but they're also infused. And through this is one of the ways that they share information and resources, is through their root system. It's a powerful reminder for us of the importance of being interconnected, because woe to the tree that stands alone when its roots can no longer support its height or weight. I thought about this a while ago with the redwoods. If your roots are shallow like the redwoods, you best be interconnected. You better live in community. I mean, there is something romantic and noble about the rugged individual, that tree living on the hill or the crag all by itself. But there is no one to catch that tree when it falls. There is no one to share resources or information. And it's the same for us as people. Fairies and clones. Shoots of trees are often called fairies, and they are clones of the original tree. These shoots not only grow into new trees, but also support the parent tree by supplying nutrients through interconnected roots. Even old stumps without foliage can survive, nurtured by the network of roots shared with their offspring. A powerful example of how life continues and thrives through connection and mutual support. And I'd like to call this one elder care forest style. So you see this old decomposed trunk here in the middle, but these tall young trees forming a circle around it, and back where we are in the frame are more trees. It creates a circle around this old stump, and they are actually still feeding this. It is still alive, covered in living cambium, even though it no longer has any leaves to produce chlorophyll of its own. Young and elderly, a mutual care network. This stump here, you can see these notches here, and this is where back in the olden days they would put in springboards, and it was like a diving board that they would stick into these notches, and the lumberjacks would stand on them, and they would use these two-handed misery whip saws. You'd have a guy on both ends, and they'd be standing on these planks 10, 12 feet up off the ground. And the reason they did that was because they didn't want to have to cut through all these whoop-de-doos and burls that are down below. And the reason I know this tree was cut down 135 years ago, part is because of these notches and that it was cut with a hand saw and not a power saw. But there was a lumber town just down the forest here called Falk. And so I know the dates and times that this forest was clear cut. But what is one of the remarkable things about the coastal redwood trees is I think over 96% of coastal redwoods reproduce through clones, through these sprouts. You can see a little one here coming up from the stump down below. And so when a tree is cut, instead of dying, it will often send up these shoots, these fairies or these clones. And so this is what a 135-year-old shoot looks like. And this is already well over 100 feet tall in this short time. It's a little bit older than these that were planted around it, but part of why it's so successful is these shoots are tapped into the ancient root network of this mother. And so even though this original trunk died, the tree itself continues to live through its clones and its offsprings. In fact, if you did a genetic test of this tree, it would come back the same as this stump. It is the same, just in a different iteration. Another way trees support each other and sustain new growth is through this phenomena called nurse logs. And these are ancient redwood trees that have fallen in the forest, and young hemlock trees have sprouted on top of them, and they have sent their roots down into and along these trees, and these trees actually act like reservoirs. They absorb water, and the trees can get nutrients out of them even in the heat of summer when the rains have long since gone. And so I love this imagery of how care is being given and how trees, even after they've died, can still pass on their legacy and aid to the young, even after they're no longer physically, well, their being is no longer with us. This is up in the Hoh rainforest up in the Olympic Peninsula. And this is a giant root ball of, I believe, a Sitka spruce that has fallen over. But if you look on top of this root ball, and I'm just sitting on the edge where the tree has fallen, and if you follow this trunk down, there is a whole forest growing on top of this fallen tree. It's become a forest unto itself. And as this tree decomposes into the soil, these trees will continue to send their roots down and establish them. Nurse logs decompose over time, recycling nutrients into the soil to nourish new growth. They host fungi, mosses, and insects, creating microhabitats that support biodiversity. Acting as moisture reservoirs, they help young trees survive during dry seasons. Nurse logs remind us that even in death, there is potential for renewal and impact. They exemplify the strength of interconnectedness supporting future generations, a powerful metaphor for leaving a legacy, giving back to the community, and fostering growth. Okay, so we're almost at 7. How about let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the seasons of life and how that relates to seasons in our own lives as people. So I will, at 6:55, I will see you back at 7. Not trees could sin. But if you define sin as that which goes against the will of God, I would say righteousness is doing that which God has created or commanded us to do. And I really believe most trees are still doing today, for the most part, what God created them to do in the beginning. And when you compare that to humans and how far we have strayed from what God created us to be and do, it's a shocking contrast. And so that's part of it.
I don't think trees can't sin, right? God created them and they're just doing their thing, what God created them to do.
God created us too, and we sure can sin.
But he gave us free will, right?
You don't think trees have a free will?
Mm.
I don't think
Don't think
trees are
trees
part
have
of the
choices.
fallen.
That's
Unless
a
they're
lot
a
of what I
fallen
do in the
tree.
woods. I'm looking at the choices trees have made. They choose to grow certain ways.
Isn't that just in the way God made them?
Well, there's the genetics of the tree, right? That gives it the parameters of how it can grow. But within those parameters are infinite possibilities.
Well, I think kind of like us, environment has an influence on the growth.
environment, yes, nurture, nature, all of those things can affect a tree.
Well, and I think too, I mean, trees are cultivated and oftentimes manipulated by man as well. So like
Grafting.
A
grafting.
lot of people don't know this, but when you prune a tree, you're actually psyching it out. You're making it think it's about to die. And so it will produce a abundance of blossoms and fruit because it's trying to make sure it passes on its life before it goes. And so it's kind of a weird thing. But
Well,
even with pruning, right? Trees got a Sabbath. Once every 7 years, you were to let a tree be and not mess with it.
Well, that
It was
also brings
a
the
good conversation. I
the
was so
paradise
surprised to
tree.
hear this.
Sorry.
Even the land in the Bible got a Sabbath, right? Land, trees, animals got a Sabbath once a week. You were even supposed to give your oxen rest. It wasn't just for humans. The earth got to rest, the trees got to rest, your animals got to rest.
What's your view on the forbidden fruit tree? How does that tree
mm,
stand out in the in your view of trees? That's my question, I
I
guess.
know this is so weird, but I probably think about it every day. And the tree of life. They were both in the Garden of Eden in the Genesis account. And Adam and Eve were allowed to eat of the tree of life. But they chose the one tree, like I seem to do every single day, that I'm not supposed to be eaten of. And I'm just thinking, who would choose knowledge over life? And I was like, oh, you, Fred, you do it all the time. And it's such a weird temptation. Um, Someday I want to write a sermon about 3 trees and talking about the tree of life in the garden, the cross, and then if you remember, the tree of life is mentioned again in the book of Revelation in heaven, and it bears fruit that we get to eat of one day. It says we get to eat of the tree of life. And some people believe the tree of life is a metaphor or a type of theophany of Jesus. I don't know if I would read that much into it, but I certainly can appreciate the imagery and the symbolism there. Um, so the Bible is full of trees, and someday we'll get there. But let's see how far I can get. I'm going to go quickly through the seasons because I want to linger more on some of these deeper life lessons. That these are more general truisms that you've probably all noticed, but I want to show some really specific things going on. So onward. Can you see the seasons? Okay. Growth in seasons. Embracing change and personal development. Just as trees experience cycles of growth, rest, and renewal, so do we. Each season has its purpose in shaping our character and drawing us closer to God. By understanding and embracing these seasons, we learn to grow, flourish, and bear fruit. There are long seasons, like childhood to old age, and short seasons where we encounter throughout life of new growth, maturity, harvest, and rest. Spring symbolizes fresh starts and new growth. It's a time of tenderness with flowers blooming, sweet fragrances filling the air, and fragile buds full of potential. This season reminds us to nurture the beginnings in our lives with gentleness and care, recognizing that great things often start small and grow steadily over time. And think about that, whether you're starting a new program, a new job, a new family, a new relationship. Think how tender the beginning is and how awkward we feel, and we're not quite comfortable, we're not quite sure how it works, and we need to be patient with ourselves and gentle and realize that these are things, we're beginners, we're newbies, and give ourselves grace, give young people under our care grace and patience as we're trying to mature them up. Don't have the same expectations you would of a sapling of a mature tree. And I'm obviously talking about people. Life is full of potentialities, and spring is often when new life begins. Remember, the young need guidance and protection. It takes time to get grounded and to have stability in our lives. But do not let fear or uncertainty rob you of your youthful vigor and hope. Enjoy the strength and enthusiasm of your youth, and realize it lasts a precious short season. Every time I walk in the woods, I think back as a kid how much easier it was and how I could jump and run along logs and all these sorts of things. And I'm so glad I did that as a kid, because now I appreciate that youthful zeal and energy that is no longer mine. Summer, embracing maturity and communion. Summer represents maturity and strength, is a season of purpose and fulfillment, where growth leads to bearing fruit. The trees provide shade and protection, becoming anchors of community and symbols of resilience. The older tree's roots run deep or interconnected with others. There is no fear of the drought of summer or the storms of winter, for they are grounded and not easily moved. This is me and my youngest up where I'm going to be speaking up at Hume Lake and Kings Canyon, and these are the giant sequoia. These are the largest trees in the world. The coastal redwoods are the tallest, but these are the largest by volume. Sequoiadendron giganteums. Fall, a time of harvest and a time of letting grow. This is something I learned. Even though the redwoods are evergreen, look at all these fallen needles. So even evergreen trees will cast their old needles to make room for new growth. And the whole forest will be covered in these beautiful orangish brown needles in fall time. It is the season of harvest, when the fruits and nuts of our labors are gathered. The long days of spring and summer give way to shorter days and the falling of leaves, signaling the need for rest and reflection. As we prepare for the winter ahead, let us rejoice in what we have accomplished, take stock of the growth achieved, and release what no longer serves us. Winter. Ooh, this is what it should look like when I get there at the end of February up there at Kings Canyon. A time of introspection, celebration, and sharing. Winter is a time to look within and to dwell with gratitude for the seasons that have gone before. It is a time we can take stock of what is of value and to share our bounty and our vision with those we have encountered in this life. A time to prepare for our transition, either for the life beyond or our next spring to come. So like I mentioned, seasons, we have the long seasons from life to death, but we also have recurring, like mini seasons that go along the way. Trunk and branches, stability, structure, and like we talked about earlier, conduits. The trunk and branches of a tree represents its stability and structure. They provide the strength needed to support its height and weight, while acting as a conduit through which nutrients flow to nourish the leaves, flowers, and fruit. Just as a tree relies on its trunk and branches, we too must have a firm foundation and a strong connection to enable growth. And as Rocky pointed out, and I'm going to make clear as I rewrite this, it is the spirit that is producing fruit in our lives, which aren't even our lives, they're his. Anatomy of a tree trunk. And hopefully this isn't too technical, and a little refresher from your high school biology. It's so interesting to me that the heartwood of a tree is dead. It's dead wood in the center of the tree. And this is going to be important to some spiritual lessons I'm going to share later. So I'm not just being a biologist on you. Then we have the live sapwood, and moisture can travel up and down the tree in this. Now, even in the dead heartwood, it can store moisture, but it is in the cambium. Life is in the cambium, and this is like the circulatory system of a tree. In fact, if you just took a strip, like an inch strip all the way around a tree, you would kill it, because you would essentially be cutting off its circulatory system from the branches to the roots. And it's quite stunning to me. Something that simple could kill a mighty tree. Then we have the phloem, the outer part or inner tree bark. And this is also where like sugars and nutrients pass. And then we have the outer bark, which protects the tree. This is one of the most trippiest things I ever learned in the woods, and I still can't stop thinking about it. And I call this trees are bridges between the earth and the sky. And so for those of you who aren't aware, trees are actually primarily the mass or substance of a tree comes from the sky. They're air beings. I assumed because they grow out of the earth, they were mostly earth type beings, but their bulk comes from the sky. And how this takes place, if you remember back to photosynthesis and what is happening is the trees are actually stripping carbon dioxide molecules from the air, and they keep one carbon atom and one oxygen atom, and they release one oxygen atom into the sky. So when we talk about trees producing oxygen, they're actually scouring dirty air and releasing pure oxygen while they're holding on to that carbon. The reverse happens when a forest fire takes place. And as you know, fire needs oxygen. So if you get enough heat and friction and these atoms moving around in this tree, and another oxygen atom is introduced, it will recombine with the carbon and oxygen atom in the tree. And there's also hydrogen from water in the tree, H2O. And the hydrogen will connect with the oxygen and be released as steam or water vapor, and the carbon and oxygen will connect with the other carbon atom and be released back into the air as CO2. And so as smoke, the tree returns to the sky from whence it came. And even though I'm not a fan of forest fires, it just makes me think about them totally differently now. It's like this complete circle of life where the trees come from the sky and build their mass from the dirty air, from the carbon in the air, and then what isn't sequestered into the soil in forest fires is returned back into the sky from whence it came. Leaves and letting go, wisdom in endings and renewal. Leaves are how trees collect light and energy from the sun and where photosynthesis takes place. In this process, leaves absorb sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and glucose, providing energy for the tree's growth. This miraculous cycle symbolizes life and renewal. As seasons change, trees let go of their leaves to conserve energy for the winter. This act of shedding reminds us of the wisdom in endings, the beauty of letting go, and the promise of renewal. Glow, flow, and let go with beauty and grace. And this is a little personal story I want to tell you about what I learned from the trees. It was 3.5 years ago now that I was told I would no longer have a job at San Diego Christian College, where I had taught for over 30 years. And it was completely out of the blue. And it was after COVID, and a lot of schools that were struggling financially and with enrollment and all those things. And they just said, we can't afford to keep you, Blackburn. You're free. We're letting you go. And it was kind of numb, right? It's like, how do you process something like that? So part of how I always process when I'm struggling is to go into the mountains or the wilderness. And I was still living in San Diego, and where I would like to go was the east side of the Sierra Nevada. And the aspens were just beginning to turn golden, and we're starting to let go. And all kinds of things were going through my head, everything from suing the school for ageism to whatever, to just rolling over and figuring it out the best I could. But as I was up in the mountains and I'm watching these trees and the rivers are flowing, the brooks are bouncing their way on their journey back to the sea, the leaves are getting ready for winter, And instead of being down and morose and melancholy about it, they put on this glorious golden show. And then the leaves would gently let go one by one. And as I watched this, I really believe God was speaking to me and said, look, Fred, look how beautiful it is to let go. And you don't have to cling. I got you. And so it was at that time I decided that I wasn't certainly going to sue. I wasn't going to have a bad attitude. I wasn't going to talk about how I'd been wronged and unappreciated. But I thank God for the time I had. And then, as graciously as I was able, I tried to glow, flow, and let go. And oh, thank God that I did, because look where he has me now. My goodness. And I would not have had that if I was still locked in some legal battle down in San Diego, or moping around, or trying to cling on to what was time to let pass.
It was pruning, right? Also.
This was beyond. This was like my trunk had been snapped off, basically, and because that was my source of income and caring for my family, and it was all my means of bringing in sustenance were gone, and it was time to simply wait and see what God would provide. Paradoxes from the woods. Competition and cooperation. And we talked about paradoxes in one of my other classes, where I talked how they were like gateposts of truth, where you get to these two opposing logical arguments and you can't seem to resolve them. And to me, that's exciting. It means I've reached the end of my knowledge, and now truth is probably somewhere just beyond this gateway. One of the first paradoxes I became aware of in the woods was the incredible competition in the canopy above for light, but the equally great cooperation that went on below ground with the entanglement of the roots. And so what a paradox to me. And I was, trying to project this into human terms, and it's kind of like, what an interesting phenomena. They all want the light for themselves, and they'll block each other out and try to snake the light by sending branches around. Yet underground, they're actually sending nutrients and resources to the trees that aren't getting enough light. So it's like they're striving, but then they're giving. And I love that connection, which seems like two completely opposite things, but somehow they're coming together in the deep, deep woods. If you see all these what these are here are actually branches that are coming off the tree. And this is what a reiteration is. So in order to get more light, it's actually turning branches into new additional trunks. And so it can have even more branches into the canopy. How incredible is that? Reiterations. Fire, a destroyer and a rejuvenator. Fires are one of the most powerful forces of nature and can bring desolation to a forest. Yet they can also bring health and renewal, another paradox. The indigenous peoples of Northern California use fire as a management tool for millennia. In some places, like where I live now, the forests were intentionally burned around once a decade, depending on how much fuel had accumulated. Frequent low-intensity fire can clear out the underbrush, allow for more grazing, and in some species, like the giant sequoia in the Sierra Nevada, they actually need fire to open up their cones and help the seeds to germinate. High-intensity fires, however, can bring total destruction, affecting not only the forest, but even the land on which they grew. When fires burn hot enough and deep enough into the soil, it actually makes the soil hydrophobic, where it repels water. And that's why we get so many the dangers of mudslides and landslides after we've had wildfires. And then when the rains come, there's nothing there if the fire is too intense to hold it into place. So the key to fire and growth, both in the forest and in our own lives, is to have frequent, low impact prescribed burns. No fires over time lead to high impact wildfires that leave destruction rather than renewal in their wake. There's a Chinese proverb that says, little sickness, long life, no sickness, short life. And I think about it in terms of fires in our lives. And I'd like you to participate with me just a little bit of like, what would be like a controlled burn we could set in our own lives that would bring health? What is
I would
like the
say
goal or the
like setting boundaries, I would say. Kind
setting
of like
boundaries?
saying, yeah, like saying no to some things to just kind of prolong, your ability to do other things.
Sure.
I think taking reproof from people, being able to be corrected.
Yeah, like a little burn.
Yeah.
Let it get rid of some of that rotted and dead stuff around us that's not healthy.
Yeah.
And
It's
repenting
hard.
of our sins too.
What's that?
Oh, repenting of
Yes.
our sins.
Yes.
Maybe also removing people in your life that bring you to sin, and just kind of clearing, watching who you're surrounded with, clearing that path.
Excellent. Love it. See, you guys are all naturals. It's just like reading. And it's a weird thing between what are we projecting and what are we bringing in? And there is like this interesting interplay going on with us as we encounter the world and others and even trees. All right, we're doing great. I'm going to try to slip in a couple more. Symbiotic relationships in the forest. I don't know what it is about me, but I hate parasites. I just hate the idea, whether it's people or worms or tree. I don't like when one thing is just living off another without contributing in any way. A symbiotic relationship, on the other hand, is mutually beneficial, where each partner in the relationship is getting something beneficial out of it. And I love this image so much. It's the mighty and tall living in harmony with the gentle and small. And trees and mushrooms have a symbiotic relationship through a network called the mycorrhizal network. This underground fungal system connects tree roots, enabling the exchange of nutrients, water, and even communication signals. And I would love to get into that with you all sometime, but not tonight. Mutual benefits. Trees provide sugars and carbohydrates to the mushrooms through photosynthesis, whereas mushrooms enhance water and nutrient absorption for the trees, such as phosphorus and nitrogen. The wood wide web, fungi act as a communication network for trees. It's almost like in our brain, if you can imagine, it's like this living brain under the forest floor with the forest roots acting almost like dendrites and synapses and neurons running through the floor, exchanging information, nutrients, and ideas. Throughout this network, older trees, often referred to as mother trees, can even transfer nutrients to younger saplings and vice versa. Fungal decomposers. Some mushrooms also decompose dead wood, recycling nutrients back into the soil, which benefits the entire forest ecosystem. Spiritual parallels. This mutual reliance mirrors community and interdependence in human life, sharing resources and thriving together. And I don't know if you're all aware of this, but these little these are called scarlet wax caps growing at the base of a coastal redwood. And this is just the fruit. Most of this mushroom is living underground, and where the little feather roots come out of the trees, the mushrooms, mycorrhizal system is around those little tiny feather roots, and it's creating. And so what we're seeing above ground is just the fruit of a much bigger plant. It's like if you see a tree, a dead tree standing or on the ground, and you see mushrooms growing out of it, what that means is that network of that mushroom has permeated that entire tree, and you're just seeing like the little bits of fruit that are poking through the dead tree and the bark. And so there's a good drawing kind of illustrating this role that mushrooms are playing in the forest trees. So here's an overview of what we've been talking about. Wisdom from the woods, new beginnings and growth, interconnectivity and community, contentment and stability, seasons affect life and mission, good is doing that which you were created to do, stability and endurance, a lust for light, reiterate or die, overcoming trauma and catastrophe, popularity can get you loved to death, how to keep giving after you're gone, seeing people like trees, glorifying God by our very lives, and always point to God. So I'm going to go through these quickly. New beginnings and growth. We talked about this already. It's going to be a time of awkwardness and struggle, but we need struggle to grow. Too much struggle and we can be crushed and stunned or destroyed, but without struggle, we will never gain strength. It's like if any of you have ever raised chickens, you probably heard you're not supposed to help the baby chicks out of their shell. They need that effort to help build up their muscles to get the strength for when they emerge that they can stand and then eat, etc. And so for me, I have to caution myself not to over intervene. Sometimes we have to let people struggle. We have to let people go through process. We can't just give them everything if we expect them to grow strong, independent, and mature someday. It's hard. It's hard watching people we love and care for struggle, but struggle's important. Too much struggle, though, is overwhelming. Interconnectivity and community. We talked about this too, about a tree standing alone is a powerful romantic symbol, and it appeals to my hermetic nature and independent self, but I clearly see the importance to be connected to others for reciprocity, support, sharing, communicating, care, teaching, learning, giving. And like I mentioned in that other slide, if you plan on being shallow, you better be connected. Contentment and stability. Learn to be content and thrive where God has planted you. What a great lesson. We're such wandering beings. We just are always looking like, well, I wonder what that church is doing next Sunday, or I wonder how it's like over in that community, or what's going on in that state or that country. But learn to be content. Grow your roots deep and wide, and you will not only stabilize yourself, but you will also support the earth and others around you. I call this tree the creeper, and he's living right at the edge of Bryce Canyon. And once again, as much as I like to think this tree walked out there for the view, you can see the soil probably came up to here at one point, and over time, it is leaving the tree. So we'll see if it can grow as quick as the soil leaves. Seasons affect life and mission. If you remember Ecclesiastes 3, there's a time and season for every purpose under the heaven. And that takes wisdom, right? To know what season it is. What should we be doing at this time in our lives? And we do have different roles and responsibilities and duties in the different seasons that we're traveling in. This one, if we had more time, I was going to fill this out together. And this was this idea of good is doing what you were created to do. And that's part of that answer to that earlier questions. Trees, for the most part, are still doing what God created them to do. As God has made us a new creation, what is it that God has created us to do? Why are we here? Why are we part of the family of God?
To glorify God and
To glorify God. That's why God made us to begin with. He made the world for his glory. And so God will be glorified in our lives. with or without us. God is glorified in the righteous, but he's also glorified in his holiness and how he deals with the evil. And so as we look at how what God has created a new life within us, and that life is meant to be, like Saint Francis talked about, we are like the hands and feet of Jesus in this world. We have the very spirit of God knit together with our own spirit, and we can be like the conduits of the divine into this world. I'm not saying that we are God, or it's our goodness or our gifts or our fruit, but we can become conduits of that divine love into the world. And I believe that is part of our purpose. Stability and endurance. This picture here is of the oldest tree in the world, and I have been looking for it ever since I first heard of it. And its name is Methuselah, after the oldest person mentioned in the Bible. And like many of like the tallest trees and the oldest, they are very carefully guarded secrets. And so it's very difficult to find out these things. The biggest tree is easy. It's General Sherman in Sequoia National Park, and they do have it fenced off. I talked about trees being loved to death, or popularity can get you loved to death. That's one of those examples. But I finally found Methuselah just last year, and he lives high in the White Mountains of California at over 11,000 feet. And this tree is over 4,800 years old. And if you're taking like a literal biblical hermeneutic, and you think about the time looking at genealogies when Noah's flood would have been, this tree would have been like a seedling at Noah's flood for you young earth creationists out there. So how crazy is that? And the White Mountains are called the White Mountains because they're made up of dolomite, which I believe is a metamorphosed seashells and sea creatures from the ocean floor. And these were metamorphosed and uplifted, and it gives the White Mountains their white appearance. And it's out of this stone that these trees grow. And speak about perspective. My God. I mean, a 4,800, almost a 5,000-year-old tree, and the things this tree has seen and endured, and it truly makes our life just seem like a vapor. Lust for light, and by lust here I mean an overwhelming passion. We need to strive for the light, for this, that is where life and energy comes from. God is referred to as the Father of lights, and Jesus is the light of the world that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. We are children of the light and should walk in it. If you remember, I think I mentioned this last week, or last time I talked, Mary is called the Theotokos in the Orthodox tradition, which means God bearer. And that's how I like to look at myself and other Christians. We're supposed to be these little lanterns traveling through the world, not shining our light into the world, but we are bearers of the divine light that is within us. Reiterate or die. These are also reiterations. So here's a tree. You can see it had fallen. Its top had been snapped off. Whoops. But instead of dying, it reiterated or turned two of its branches into new trunks. In this case, this tree wanted even more light than it already had, so it turned one of its branches into multiple trunks. And this may not seem very big. It's hard to tell because there's no scale, but these reiterated trunks are taller than any tree east of the Mississippi, growing on a branch on a redwood tree. That's how big the trees are here in California compared to other parts of the country. Reiterate or die. This tree here has had its top blown off. And this is like what I was talking about. This is how I saw my teaching career. I had this 30-year growth, this beautiful tree, bringing in all this light and resources and energy, and fruit was being given, and shade and protection. And just like that, it was snapped off. And when I saw what these trees were doing, it was so inspirational for me. And this is what I have been doing the last 3 years in my life. Instead of just one slender trunk, I now too have reiterated, and I'm sending up different little branches. One of them is guest lecturing for Rhombus University and trying to help streamline and improve your program. Another is doing arts and crafts. Another is learning woodworking. Another is working as a ranger. Another is substitute teaching. So now instead of just one trunk, and when I lost that, instead of giving up and dying, it's now reiterating and finding different avenues. And some of these will peter out over time, and others might turn into magnificent trunks on their own. And so this is part of what I've learned from these trees. These trees are called Sequoia sempervirens, Sequoia after the Cherokee Indian who created a language for the Cherokee people. And sempervirens is Latin for ever living. And these trees continue, even if the main mother dies, they continue living on through their clones and their offspring. Almost done. Overcoming trauma and catastrophe. This is called a basal hollow, and the entire inside of this tree has been burned out up to about 60 feet inside. And most of us, like trees, will experience some form of trauma or profound loss in our lifetimes. The trauma and loss of some can provide a place of sanctuary and refuge for others. This is true on a physical and a metaphysical level. Just like this redwood, whose trial and hollowing by fire has left space for woodland creatures to find shelter, so too, we who have suffered great trauma and loss can be a shelter to others. The key isn't suffering trauma, but our response to it. If we fill the wound with rot of bitterness and regret, we won't have room to receive the joy of having an empty space within that is open to those who need refuge from the storms of life. Embrace your wounds, for this is where the light enters in and where the glory shines out. May we learn to be sheltering trees and provide refuge from the storm. We spend most of our life trying to hide our flaws and our wounds, almost like a broken vessel or pottery. And we try to put little patches on it and put paint on it. And Paul talked about rejoicing in his infirmities and his weaknesses, because where he was weak, that is where the strength of God was manifest and shown out. And so when I see these deep wounds, I think of trauma and wounds and suffering as like the means by which God actually carves us out. There's this thing called the parable of the flute, where in order to make a flute, the master musician must first take a reed, dry it out, and then hollow it. He has to remove the inside. He has to remove it from itself. And he'll even bore holes into the outside of this reed. Yet now the reed has become useful, because now that it has been removed from itself, the breath of the master can blow through it, producing the very sound of God. And so when you're experiencing trauma and suffering, think about it as God using these things. And once again, how do we respond? Are we angry? Are we resentful? Are we bitter? Or do we thank God and say, I may not understand it. I don't know why I'm going through this, but please create a place in me where I can be empathetic and gentle and kind to others. May I give them sanctuary from the storms of life in this place you have created inside of me. May we become sheltering trees. Popularity can get you loved to death. This is actually a picture of the forbidden part of the forest. You are not allowed to go on the right side of this creek, because this is where the tallest tree in the world lives. But so many people wanted to go and meet Hyperion, who is knocking on, he just went over 380 feet, if you can imagine. That's like over a football field, including the end zones. If you laid this tree down, would be longer, I mean, taller than that field is long. And because so many people like me wanted to go in and love on this tree, they had to shut off this part of the forest. And so now I have to observe him from afar. But I just thought that was an interesting thing, that popularity can have its downfalls. And how to keep giving after you're gone. Our life should include legacy and care for our progeny even after we're gone. This can be done physically through genetics, intellectually through ideas, and metaphysically through the Spirit of God. Children are heritage from the Lord, and even for those of you who have no biological children, like myself, remember there are many ways to have children in this world. Even though I was like the celibate hermit monk living by myself, I ended up with 6 kids and a family that I raised in my household. And I have countless students that I consider like my intellectual or faith children over the years. And it's just been wonderful to be able to pour into other people's life and to hopefully provide a legacy that will continue long after we're gone. I learned this from Ram Dass, who, even though I believe he's a Hindu, I think he identifies, maybe Buddhism, but I think he identifies in Hinduism. And I read this thing years ago by him, and I thought it was so beautiful. Seeing people like trees, because I don't know about you all, but I can get so judgmental of myself and others, all like that artistic stinking temperament, right? That stinking perfectionism. I'm putting that on others and I'm putting it on myself. And this is what Ram Dass had to say. When you go out into the woods and you look at trees, you see all these different trees, and some of them are bent, some of them are straight, and some of them are evergreens, and some of them are whatever. And you look at the tree and you allow it. You see why it's the way it is, that forest forensics I was talking about. You sort of understand that it didn't get enough light or water or whatever, and so it turned out that way. And you don't get all emotional about it. You just allow it. You appreciate the tree. The minute you get near humans, you lose all that. And you are constantly saying, you're to this, or I'm to this. That judging mind comes in. And so I practice turning people into trees, which means appreciating them just the way they are. I love that so much. And I have tried to incorporate this instead of judging people because they look poor or dirty or bent or whatever, just realize they didn't just happen that way. Life happened to these people. They are that way for a reason. And to have a little empathy and understanding and a little less judgment and condemnation. Glorifying God by our very lives. This is one of the most, this tree here, I nicknamed it Tenacity, and it's one of the most amazing beings I have ever encountered. It is a coastal redwood that has burned completely through. I'm actually sitting in the middle of this burned out tree. Yet miraculously, it is still living and even thriving. These are its own branches out the top. It's still growing. When I first saw this tree, I thought it was such a perfect illustration as to how I view a mature Christian life. The old man has been reckoned dead, and all the rot and decay. Remember we talked about the heartwood, how it's dead wood? All the dead wood can be removed, yet the tree is still alive because the life is in the cambium. It's not in the heartwood. All that remains is the structure of who we were, but now we are clothed in the very living cambium of Christ. As we decrease, may he increase, so all who behold us will be struck by wonder at how one so diseased and frail can be full of life, beauty, and vitality. May all that remain in you be that which has been renewed and regenerated by God, so that he may be glorified for the great work that he has done. Always point to God. One of my favorite things about trees is that they always point to God. Now you may be thinking, but trees point every direction, up, down, left, right, above, below. forwards, backwards, outwards, inwards. And so it is for God, is omnipresent. And my tree teachers always remind me of him. May we too be like the trees and have our lives be constant pointers to God and his goodness, to God and his goodness. For he goes before us, watches behind us, is to our left and to our right, above and below, outside, and most amazingly of all, within us. And Dr. Tracy actually sent me this, which I appreciated. How nature can help mental health. It reduces stress, improves mood, improves sleep, improves concentration, reduces anxiety, improves social connections, and improves mindfulness. It helps you be present without all the distractions. How to connect with nature? Well, you got to get in it. Get out there. Go camping, spend time in forest, tune into your senses to the sound, smell, and the light. So in closing, be content where you are planted, strive for growth and to live in the light, drink plenty of water, develop and connect with community, support those around you, bear fruit in due season. Remember, fruit takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. Give yourself time. And remember, it's not our fruit. We are conduits. Provide shade and sanctuary. Let God heal our wounds. We certainly can't heal ourselves. Never give up. Learn to reiterate. Keep on giving, even after you die. So thank you so much for letting me share that with you. I really appreciate it. And I feel a lot better for my talk up at Joshua. And hopefully those younglings won't think I'm too much of a weirdo for my tree passions. And if you ever come up here, any of y'all, I will give you a grand tour and I will show you some of these tree friends.
I was going to ask about that.
Yes, come see me. It's one of my favorite things to do is to take people into the woods and to show.
I don't know how far you have to send the, I don't know where you're.
13-hour drive away.
Where is here again?
I'm up in Eureka in Humboldt, California. Almost to Oregon.
Is there a landing strip nearby?
Yes, we do have a little airport and there's direct flights out of Burbank.
Everyone can just meet us, me and Katie in NorCal, and we'll carpool up. We'll pick up, I think we have at least one or two other people.
Maybe you guys could charter a bus or something and we could do a crew.
That would be fun.
Would be.
So there's a landing strip in Eureka?
Yeah, in McKinleyville, but it's our airport. It's about 20 minutes from me. And so that's usually what
What's the best time to come?
Burbank and then rent a car and drive down to San Diego. It's cheaper than trying to fly all the way to San Diego for me.
What do you recommend it was like the best time to come, like season wise? Probably any, huh?
Yes. Right now it's great because almost no one's here. I have the woods to myself. And it's really something seeing these woods in the rain because they flood. That's the tall trees like the floodplains, obviously, right? And I'll be sloshing around up to my knees in water. It's just like the whole woods become a river. And in fact, that's what I'm going to go do tomorrow. I'm going to go play in the forest of God.
Are you near? I can't remember if you mentioned. Are you anywhere near Hyperion?
I'm about an hour south of Hyperion.
Really? What's that like?
It's magical. It's like I'm living in a green dream.
I remember I used to teach botany and be a trail guide, and so I really appreciate all this. Like we were talking about heartwood and everything. I used to teach the kids that stuff. But we went to this one, it wasn't Hyperion's grove, but it was this one grove of redwoods. And the tallest one there, it was like it had that atmospheric effect where you look at the top of like a skyscraper and there's so much air between you and the building that's like that atmospheric effect. And the top of the tree that was happening, that's how tall it was. And I was just like, blown away by that.
Yeah, a lot of these trees you can't see the top when you're standing under them. You can only see up to like the first few branches because the canopy blocks out your view. And in some of those trees I showed you, the redwoods, part of their survival strategy is they drop their lower branches. So if a big fire event does come, it can't get up into the canopy. Some of these redwood trees, the branches don't even start for 100 feet. Some 200 feet. There's a redwood tree where the first branch is 250 feet up. It's just incredible. Any other comments or questions or spiritual insights or connections that percolated up while we were talking about this stuff? While you're thinking, part of what Joshua Wilderness Institute wants me to talk about, they're about to do a mission trip down into, I think Watts, down into LA. And they want me to talk to them about worldviews. So I'm going to give them a worldview sampler. I've already given you guys some of that in different formats, but I do get to speak again a couple nights in March. And so please communicate to me if there's anything, a topic, especially in my fields of philosophy or religion or anthropology, and things that you think you would find helpful in your counseling and the career choice that you're pursuing.
Do you ever, trying to think of how to say this, but for me, help in personal life and just like working with people in general, knowing how to communicate effectively with people who love to debate and argue.
Oh, yes.
Really cool. And I feel like as a philosophy person, it's like, wait, a lot of them love that. So maybe you have insight on that.
I
How do we
do.
rise above and stay cool and calm during it, but also, you know.
And speak of seasons of life. I'm in a different season of my life now than I was. When I was a young professor, I was like a bantam hen, and I just wanted to get in there and I wanted to wrestle. I wanted to fight. I wanted to argue. And now where I'm at is I don't argue with people anymore. And I acknowledge what they're saying. I'm happy to discuss it with them, but I no longer care to debate or argue, because what I found generally would happen is, and I don't care how good an arguer you are, it's rare that you can so overwhelm someone by your brilliance that you can change their mind and bring them into your camp, your way of thinking. And what usually happens is you may win the fight or the argument, but then they're going to go and they're going to research more how to counter what you did to them. And so you're going to force them even deeper into the position you're trying to take them from. And then say they come back and you defeat that argument, you're going to drive them even deeper as they learn to counter your counter. And so that was one of the life lessons I learned, that arguing with people can actually be counterproductive. And it doesn't mean we have to agree with them or roll over, but I would love to talk about some techniques about how to have a conversation with people that are being combative or bombastic. And
I like those adjectives.
Well, yeah. And you know what? I would say you mentioned something like earlier where you said we're like a vapor. And I think about that all the time. This is what's helping to shape my perspective, because even when you look at the world having over 8 billion people, and even how old the world is, and even when you equate that to the trees, it just puts us in that like perspective of being a vapor. Like we reckon the more small I recognize I am, the more I start to let go, or like you said, trying to have these arguments and convince people. And another thing our pastors say is like, do you want to be right or do you want to make an impact? So it's like you can fight to try to win, but what's the goal? To make a difference, or to make an impact? That's what, so it's not about winning, and just putting it in a perspective of when you recognize how many people are on the planet, how small, how old it is, we're literally like vapors.
Yes.
You like screaming to nothing, you know, except to God, you
Yes.
know.
Yes, thanks, Cindy. And think about what Cindy's saying there about perspective. And like right now, I'm in my little office room and I loom pretty large in this small space. And look how big we all look in these little Hollywood squares. But once you step out into the forest or you gaze up at the stars at night, you begin to realize we're not all that after all, and we are quite insignificant. And there's another paradox. We're insignificant little specks on a mid-rate solar system in a third-class galaxy whipping around the center of the universe, and God still cares about us. And that's a paradox, and I love it. Anyone else?
The presentation that you showed us, that you went through,
Yes.
are you gonna have that in a book or something along those lines? It's beautiful.
One day I would love to
inspiring.
turn that into a coffee table book with some of my images and thoughts. And
Yeah.
I'd love to pre-order.
and for those of you that want to see, I mean, those were all just stills, but if you're into that sort of thing, this is what I do on social media. And my Facebook account, I'm probably posting tree pictures and thoughts on them every day, and also on my YouTube and my TikTok channels, which are both under my name, Darkwater Hermit. One word, Darkwater Hermit. You can find me.
Under Darkwater Hermit?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat. It's just one word. And that's actually my family name. Blackburn means out of dark waters. It's a Scots-Irish name, and a burn is like a creek or a stream. And so out of dark waters. And that's both my YouTube and TikTok channel. And I have full classes. In fact, I just threw up the recording of our last class onto my YouTube channel, but I know you can access them on Populi. But I have full college courses on there from back when I was teaching. I used it a lot for teaching, and I have huge playlist because I've been, you know how wild YouTube is. I mean, there's so much on there, but there's so much junk. And so I've spent decades scouring and making files for all the different religions, for different philosophies, for just the things I'm interested in. So if you get, check out